Hi, and welcome back to the online study of preparing for PPA certification. We're now on Section D of Composition and Design. Section D says, use angle of view to produce the desired effect, mood, power, size, strength, etc. Now there's 6 items on the exam from this section, so there's quite a bit to cover in a very short time. Number 1 says, knowledge of perspective effects and how to achieve these effects. Perspective, camera angle, and camera position. So this study asks us to take a second look at perspective. You may recall that in Section B of Cameras, Lenses, and Attachments, we had a pretty thorough discussion of perspective and angle of view. One of the things that we learned there is that you don't change perspective simply by changing lenses. The only way to actually change perspective is by changing the location of the camera, moving further back, moving forward, moving higher, moving lower, left or right. That changes perspective. Simply changing the lens or zooming a lens does not change perspective. Another thing that we talked about back in that study was the fact that when you take the camera and you tilt it up at, let's say, a building, you suddenly get converging lines of the building. In other words, the building is not straight. And that's because the building plane is not parallel to the sensor plane when you tilt that camera up to capture the building. Now, in that case, that's really a distortion. Some people would call it a distortion. If you don't like the effect, you would call it a distortion. I'm sure the architect would consider that a distortion if their building didn't look straight. But it's really a problem of perspective. It's a problem that the camera position is not in alignment with the building. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those problems here as it pertains to photographing people. Now you can use this knowledge of perspective to control the psychology and perhaps the physical stature of your clients by using it to your advantage. For example, if you have someone that you want to have appear either taller or more dominant or portray a sense of strength or power within an image, you can lower the perspective or lower the camera angle, and by doing so, that makes the subject appear stronger and more powerful and more authoritative. Just the opposite of that will occur if you take a higher camera angle and shoot at a higher perspective down onto someone, because that has a tendency to give a belittling effect to the subject, almost making them look dominated or insecure. So you can use this to your advantage. You can also use it incorrectly. For example, high camera angles on children almost never work. I guess there are situations where they certainly could, but in general, you don't want to photograph children from a high camera angle because of this belittling effect on them. Now here's an example of where I photographed a high school senior from a high camera perspective. I did it to just sort of give us an overall view of all the stuff that she brought to the session. Here's an image where I used a more traditional camera angle, and it works too, but the visibility of her stuff is not as good as it was when I changed to a higher camera angle. The trick here is not to let the stuff overpower the subject. If the camera angle's too high, then it really does have a distortion or a foreshortening effect of the senior, and it won't be nearly as enjoyable a photograph for them to purchase. Now here's something you may not have thought of. Since elements closer to the lens appear larger, you can use this to your advantage to help flatter subjects that may be a little on the heavy side. By leaning their face in towards the lens and moving their body further away, that helps minimize their weight. This is a great example of perspective at work. It's okay to use slightly higher camera angles in situations where you're trying to flatter the subject. For example, Higher camera angles may hide a double chin, a thick neck, or even to help open up the eyes. It's all about flattering the subject. But there are 3 guidelines that we want to make sure we remember from our discussion back in cameras, lenses, and attachments. These guidelines are to help minimize distortion when you're photographing people. The first is, for full-length poses, the camera should be placed near the level of the subject's waist, and the lens should be level with the ground. For standing poses cropped to a 2/3 view, position the camera near the level of the subject's chest with the lens level to the ground. And finally, for head and shoulders poses, position the camera slightly above the subject's chest level and with the lens level to the ground. Those are 3 important guidelines to remember on the exam, because while they're not hard, fast rules, that's ripe pickings for exam writers to find questions when there are 6 questions from this section. So I would make sure you remember full length, 3/4 length, and close-up. Where is the best camera position? Number 2 says, knowledge of the elements of composition that create different effects, including rule of thirds, leading lines, positive negative space, etc. Now the rule of thirds gives us suggestions for the placement of our subject, or as we learned a little earlier, the center of interest. Mentally divide the viewfinder into thirds like a tic-tac-toe board, and then place the center of interest on one of the 2 horizontal or vertical lines. The intersecting points are also strong positions to use for placement of the center of interest or other important elements. One thing to know about the rule of thirds is it's okay to break it, but there's a time and place for that. Be sure you know when that time and place is. The placement of the heads in the upper right intersection give this image a strong visual composition of the bride and groom. This image utilizes the rule of thirds for the placement of the house, the birds, and the lower horizon line. Leading lines. Now when it comes to arranging elements within your compositions, leading lines are dynamic. The eye enters an image from left to right, assuming you read from left to right, and travels a visual path for the composition. Diagonal leading lines are a great way to direct the viewer's eye to the subject. The diagonal lines created by the windowsills and the baseboards all point to the subject and help hold the viewer's eye onto the dancer. Positive space and negative space. By definition, positive space is the area within the image that is occupied by the subject. All of the rest of the space is considered to be negative space. In dealing with the subject, we have to make compositional decisions on how to best present that subject. In this image, the model is in the positive space by definition. All of the rest of the building interior makes up the negative space. In composition, we use negative space to present the subject. It is as important to the visual success of the image as just about every other aspect of creating the image. Background color, background textures, tonal values, light values, and balance of negative space with positive space are just a few of the considerations for selecting the negative space for a given subject. In this image, I selected high key or light values for my negative space to make the subject stand out, since it was in such stark contrast to the low key or dark values of her black shirt and her dark hair. In this image, I used a location of contrasting tonal and color values to set my subject apart. The uniform yellow and green hues in the negative space created a nice presentation to set off my model in her dark shirt and dark hair. The brightness of her face is also in harmony with the brightness of the flowers. In this image, there's a nice balance of positive and negative space. It also uses strong vertical lines in the negative space to set off the strong diagonal line of this dance pose. The black mat contains the entire image and helps to focus the attention on the dark tonal values of the dancer. So how important is the relationship of the negative space to the positive space? Very. Improper use of negative space may leave the subject feeling very crowded, with little room to breathe or for movement. In this image, the tight crop leaves the feeling that the subject is confined and boxed in. Well, that's it for Section D. We're now on to Section